Good evening. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing fine.
I had my video turned off. Sorry about that.
No, and
What
yourself?
time is it over there?
It's 7 o'clock in the evening.
Good, good.
So it's actually perfect that we managed to. I understand it's around 10 in the morning.
Well, in I'm in New York time, so it's 1 p.m. for me.
Okay, so so actually it's perfect for me because if it was later in the evening, it would be probably late night here. If so, so it's. And I thought about it earlier today that this is actually one of the weekly highlights. So at least now when I'm not, I'm actually not talking much with IT people. At least not as much as I used to. So actually being able to just speak IT with someone because my wife, she's not that much interested in IT. She listens to me, but she just smiles and nods.
Yeah, I feel guilty for talking to my wife about stuff all the time about work because I know it's not her passion and not her interest, but she appreciates the opportunity to chat and when talk about stuff that interests me and talk about stuff that interests her. And
Mm.
but I definitely appreciate that. She doesn't just tune me out and eyes gloss over. She gives me good feedback, you know?
That's nice.
Hey
I
everybody.
assume you've been together several years,
Yes.
so she knows you very well.
Yeah, she's got me down pat.
Hey, I wanted to let everyone know I finally got this Zoom right. Carolyn tested it out for me. She was able to log in and it was recording before I even got here. So I'm
Oh,
super
really?
excited about that.
Oh, we're already recording?
Yeah,
Yeah, we
Carolyn
know all
also.
your secrets now.
Yeah.
And they will be posted to YouTube as well. So
Yeah, I'm not editing. I'm just gonna post everything all you guys said, all your secrets and everything.
Why can't we like stop recording and then restart?
Nope. Nope. Yeah. If there's really something bad, I will, of course, edit it out.
I see.
So I think we've got plenty of people. Should we just get started?
Sounds
Yeah.
fine to me.
All right. Cool. So I posted a bunch of stuff here because no one else did.
Oh man. Guilt trip.
for next time or now. Is there anything on this list now that folks want to cover first? All right. Let's start from the top then. I was interested in web middlewares. And I kind of have heard of some and I've used some, but I wanted to hear what other folks think. Other experiences with web middlewares. Do folks know what they are? Maybe we can start there. Do folks know what web middlewares are?
I think that sounds very smart to start there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what they are.
Okay.
Yes. Aaron, is it related to Golang only, or I can talk with any other language I have experience with middleware?
I think that they are a concept in other languages too. So why don't you give it a shot, Ankur?
Yeah. So sure. So I have been using the so my experience is basically with the JavaScript Node.js part. So I have been using Express.js basically. So what I know about from the middleware of Express.js is basically how you before suppose a request comes in. So before processing the request, you want to execute certain number of steps before the request actually get processed at the last function. So middleware is a kind of interceptor, or you can think of it as a function that gets executed before it actually gets the request gets called at your controller function. So I might not be 100% correct in defining the correct way of the middleware.
That's perfect. That's a perfect representation, and that's what I understand it to be, and that's definitely what they do in Go. So I think your experience from Node does correspond to the Go experience.
Yeah, that was my understanding too of what they are. Ankur, do you have experience with middlewares with Go?
No, Aaron. Right now, I haven't started with web development with Go. Right now, I'm basically just completed the tour of Go, and then I started with that day. I had a chat with you, right? I started with writing a text editor in Go so that I learn more about the fundamentals, and I have never coded with the system level programming. So I wanted to get to the bare metal of the system more closely. So I started with that. Because I have been doing this web programming, designing architecture and all these things, RabbitMQ, all this thing, web architecture too long. It's been 2 years in the Node world. So I've never been this close to the system level. So I wanted to go over there first.
Cool. Well, nice to have you at the system level. Welcome.
Yeah.
So cool. So Carrick, I see that you have an example. You have a library, right?
Yeah. So I was actually going to start right where Ankur was talking about what middleware does for us. And the Ankur answered it correctly. And actually in the Go world, it really works nicely because in Go, we have this concept of interfaces such as, if you expose an interface on a structure, then people or programs that haven't even been written yet could adapt to that structure better, just because we know what methods that particular structure has or needs to have to be used in a particular instance. So when we can use those interfaces, we can adapt and build components together and still have the compiler do compile time checking to make sure it actually we are passing the appropriate structures around. In a similar way, and it's not exact, but in a similar way, middleware allows us to write a function that is a generic HTTP request handler. And if we write it with a particular function signature, then we can use it in ways that we've not thought about, other people have not thought about, and can come up with and use it later. They can compose them and build upon each other. And so I'd like to start with demonstrating what middleware, Golang middleware looks like. an application of why you might want to use it. And then we can even live code a new middleware that you guys want to live code together. You can give me suggestions so we can figure out how to make it work. So if that sounds good, I'll start with a demonstration of why one might need middleware or want to use that as a tool to get a particular job done.
Sweet. Let's try. I wanted to also see Encore's Go text editor later on. So what do we think about spending maybe 20 minutes or so on that and then getting to the text editor? Cool with that?
Sounds good.
Sweet. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. No, please. Okay, so I'm going to share my one of my screens here. Which one am I going to share? Safari. There we go. Okay, so let me enhance. Okay, so this is a small library. I'm not going to dive into it, but it does have some middleware, HTTP middleware, and there's some examples of why one might use it. But I'm going to jump in. Actually, let me fix this here. And start with the main function right there in the screen. Is that large enough for people to see?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So in here, this is a little program, and it's just a silly example at the top of the README file, in which case I want to have a little web server. I want to serve files, static files over HTTP port 8080. And there is a static file handler in the standard library, but this is slightly different. But this also has some other middleware handlers going. This has some other features that I'm also demonstrating. Why would you might want to use middleware? Let's take a look at this line right here with compression. It's not exactly obvious, but what that is doing, I think this might be a really simple and straightforward example of how one or why one might want to have middleware. You can have an HTTP handler, and then you can wrap it with a middleware generating function, and then send your request to the resultant handler. And then whenever an HTTP request comes in, before it calls the original handler, and then in this case, sorry for slurring my words. In this case, let's say the original handler was a static handler, and then we're going to wrap it with this with compression middleware function. And what that is doing is it looks at the HTTP request headers, and if compression is requested in the request header, it will actually go back, make the call for the original handler, and then compress the results, and then ship the bytes back over in the response and set the handlers correctly. So as opposed to writing a compression handler for every single HTTP handler you have, let's say you've got 5 or 6 endpoints in a particular application, you only need to write that with compression handler once, and then you can use it anywhere you want to allow compression to work. In this case, I'm also rewrapping that middleware with another middleware that handles counters, logging, and timeouts for us. So then I take that handler, HTTP handler, after I've composed it with 2 different or 3 different middlewares, and you can chain these. You can chain as many of these as you want together. There's a performance question. Obviously, if you chain them together a really long chain, it slows down because you're running more code. But if they have the same function signature, you can chain these together in whatever format makes sense for your application. In the end, I take this HTTP middleware that wraps all the other handlers, and I just send it to the HTTP handle function, which registers that handler for all things coming in, all requests coming in with static in the URL. And then I run my program as normal. So what does that do? Well, with compression, the first thing that will get called, I'll just explain it like this. The first thing that gets called is H. Well, H is wrapping, it's a handler, middleware handler that wraps the existing handler with a bunch of features. And this particular handler takes care of counters for 1xx, 2xx, 3xx, 4xx, 5xx statuses. It handles logging. It handles timeouts. And then after it wraps the handler, it also goes ahead and it, after the logging and counters handler is called, it defers to this handler, the previous one in the stack. And then once this one runs, it defers to the one underneath, which is a static handler. So it unwraps them layer by layer like an onion and calling the next handler in succession. And here's, as I scroll up, I'm going to give another example. Handlers are wrapped like this, where handler A will, the handler A code will be called first, and then handler B code, and finally handler C code. It's equivalent to wrapping your handlers like, one after the other, like shown in example 2.
Hey, Carrick.
Yes.
Carolyn put a question in the chat, and I also have the question.
Okay.
I realized that I have the question that I didn't even know because Carolyn wrote it.
I'm reading it now.
Okay.
So Carolyn wrote, should most of us consider using existing middleware, or are people writing their own to do magic stuff just for their own company's business logic? I don't know the answer for everyone else, but in my case, I would prefer to use middleware that adheres to the Go standard libraries function signatures. There are some middleware out there that breaks you out of that and requires you to have a different function signature. I'm not a fan of that, but there are lots of great middleware out there that does have a different function signature. I typically don't have stuff for my company, Business Logic, but I think it's a perfect place to put Business Logic in a middleware if that's appropriate. Maybe for handling logins, or maybe you've got Business Logic that you need to put on top of logins to handle it correctly. And maybe an existing middleware might not actually handle logins like you would need to have them handled.
So I guess my question was mostly like, can I abuse and use middleware to kind of give myself eventing to kind of always hook into common things and workflows that happen for all my requests? Does that make sense? Like, because a lot of what you're talking about is like compression or auth or things like that, where it's like, it's general to everybody. And like, am I abusing it if I use it to do my own weird stuff too?
I don't think so, Carolyn. I think it's no different than, it's really, you're just writing a function. And just like you might take a few nuggets of logic and capture it in a function and use that in 3 or 4 different places, there's no different between that and putting that logic in a middleware function, because that's all it is. It's nothing fancy other than a function. And then telling your HTTP request handler, call this middleware, and then that middleware can call the next middleware in series after some little bit of logic is done. And the cool part is you can have it do logic at the top of your middleware function, call the next function in line, and then do some wrap-up logic at the end. And that I learned about that in Lisp many years ago, how you can decorate some functions and have, stuff to call before the main function, and stuff to call afterwards. And middleware is perfect for that. And actually, this library does that with the logging and error handling. And there's examples of how to do that in this library. Again, I'm not suggesting you go out and use this library. I'm just saying, if you're looking to write middleware function, I've got a lot of different examples in this library, so you can play around with it and see what you like for yourself.
Cool, thank you.
Here's an example I put on the screen. This, it's under the error section, but it's a silly example. And this particular middleware function only allows get HTTP methods to actually get through. And in which case, there's this concept when you're writing middleware of you're wrapping another handler. And we call that the next handler. That's not something I created. It's something that I found was pretty common in some other libraries. And so that's how you specify the function to call when you want to allow the request to continue on down the stack. So this is pretty much, this line right here is pretty much boilerplate, and I could talk about that, but it would be boring to you guys. And here's the meat of the logic, Carolyn, or not just to you, but this is like a little bit business logic where I'm saying if the request method is not equal to get, and that probably should be a constant, HTTP dot, request get, I forgot what the constant is. But if the method is not get, then do the following, signal an error and return. Otherwise, call the next. And you'll see this a lot in middleware. When you're writing middleware, you call the next dot serve HTTP function with W and R. In this case, you just want to serve the request just like it is, but there's some circumstances where maybe you want to modify headers and do other things, and there's examples of how to do that as well. But this is a very simple example of a middleware function that does one thing and one thing only. It gates, it prevents your underlying underlying handler from receiving anything but a get call. Does anyone have any questions about this example?
So when I chain them together, does it just kind of look like functions, like nesting functions together? Like, could you show what it would look like if I chain like 3 or 4 together?
Sure. If you chain them together, you chain. Yes, there's another question.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just have the follow-up question what you just asked. So basically what I wanted to ask is, so suppose you are calling next, right? So how does this handler function are stored? Means suppose for particular route, I want to call so for one particular route only, I want to call this some middlewares, not for all the HTTP routes.
That's a really awesome question.
This gets stacked up or stored over there in the Golang.
That's a really great question, and I really agree with that way of building your application, where you kind of peel off the first level and then handle it. You route on that accordingly. I like that a lot. It's very easy to follow. The middleware is one way of handling that if you want to, but it's not required. I don't know if you're asking if I have an example of doing that, though. Is that what you're asking?
No, I just wanted to know how does the Golang handles all the routes, means suppose middleware, what is the data structure, underlying data structure they are storing for all the middleware to process one by one? Okay,
so routing is orthogonal or completely separate from middleware. Middleware is now middleware can do routing, or middleware can also be ignored and you can use a different router entirely. So you can use a middleware to do your routing, but you don't have to if you don't want to. The Go routers are very good. There's also some really good third-party routing handler routers that also work very fast and efficiently, without creating like a lot of garbage or heap allocations along the way. Go ahead.
Hey, Gary. No, so I just wanted to mention, to answer the other person's question, I think the way the middlewares are being set up, the way Garrick is explaining, it seems more like what you call a decorator in other languages. It just wraps around, and the main mux, whether it's a default mux or the non-default mux that the Golang's HTTP is handling, it is not aware of the entire sort of like the list of middlewares that the request is going through. All it knows is the one that has been handed to the mux right at the top. So there's no data structure that Go handles to maintain a list of middlewares. It's just how you create the sort of decorator list and giving it to Go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you very much for answering that question more fully. I appreciate it, Sandeep. Um, and I was thinking some of that while he asked the question, and I forgot to mention it. And I think you went above and beyond and actually added to it as well. So, yeah, middleware, yeah, it's just a function pointer. A router is given a function pointer, whatever that router might be, that's going to look at the URL and determine how to route your request. It is only given a single function pointer, and that is the handler function that it was configured to call. And if that's a chain of functions that call each other, then that's the router is ignorant of how that works. But someone did bring up, could you create middleware that actually does routing? And yes, absolutely, I've seen that done. For instance, this little example here could be a switch, and that switch could say, hey, let's peel off the first leftmost segment of the URL. And if it is, one component, maybe it is, API v1, then go call one particular handler that handles all the v1 APIs. If it's a API v2, then call a different handler that actually handles all the v2 API. So you could do routing from middleware, but it's not typically done that way. It's mostly done using one of the existing standard library router or a third-party router, and then you just give it a pointer to the top handler function, and they could have middleware functions in between as it works its way down to be handled ultimately by the final HTTP handlers.
So Ankur, were you asking in general how to do routing with HTTP in Go?
No, right now, no, I was not asking. Sandeep, I think most of the doubt I had, Sandeep has got it. I got it cleared from Sandeep.
Oh,
What
cool.
he told.
Awesome, cool. Aaron, I'm sorry, I totally forgot the rest of your question.
That's cool. So I was just asking, can I chain a bunch of these middlewares together? And what would that look like in the code?
So you absolutely could chain a bunch of them together. Here's an example right here. I've got the foo handler, and I have no idea why I called it foo handler, but maybe because it's just a simple handler that writes hello world. I should have called it should have had it written foo on the response writer. But here's a foo handler, and in this case, I'm actually just chaining two different middleware functions together. I'm adding compression support. So if a client comes in with their accept encoding set with gzip or a couple of other compression methods, the with compression middleware will automatically do the compression, remove those compression headers from the request so that this guy does not see it, because you don't want to compress it twice, and then take the unencoded response from here and then compress it. So you do chain them together just like this, with one calling the next. Remember, they work from outside in. So in this case, with compression gets called first, and then foo handler gets called second. There's another example. Example 1 and example 2 are identical in that handler A will always be called first and can programmatically decide to deal with the request itself or pass it off to handler B. And then handler B can do something with the request or pass it off to handler C. In both of these examples, it's chained exactly the same way. I don't know if that's can be seen here, but you're calling a function. So handler C is a function, which is the formal argument to handler B. And then that handler B returns a function, which is a formal argument to handler A. And then the result of handler A is H, and H is what you use when you give it to your router to actually handle the request. Remember, the router takes the HTTP handler function, and then if the URL matches the stub on what the router was given, it will call that particular handler function, which in this case is just labeled H.
Got it.
Okay, there's another question. I'm gonna read it. So from Sandeep, it says, shall I just say that when using the HTTP package from Golang, I am forever confused between handler func, and have to look at the doc each time to find out the difference after some hard scratching. Oh my gosh, Sandeep, this is my pain and frustration, or this used to be my pain and frustration a long time ago. I definitely agree with you. Back when I started programming in Go, I never heard of middleware, and as many of you might have not heard it until even today. And I would write all of my HTTP handlers like this right here, this foo handler, and it was very simple. And I did not have to cast middleware around with this silliness right here. I think that the community that made the middleware might have taken a slightly different turn, and we would not have needed to have all these castings everywhere. In the end, if you've got a typical function that handles a request, which is an HTTP handler, which happens to be a function, and you want to cast it to use in middleware, you always have to wrap it in this cast here, which just tells the compiler that it's got to serve HTTP method, or it actually implements serve HTTP method, so it can be called by the router. I'm sorry I'm not saying that very much better, but the bottom line is I share your angst with that, and we just have to sillily wrap our handlers with this handler func cast.
Could I try to add to that? Is that cool?
Sure, please do.
So here is my understanding, is that it's like Carrick said, is handle func is a function that you can call that will tell the Go standard library router like what handler to call for what path. So in yours, Carrick, you had, I think, static, and that called H. But then the other one is handler func. And that one, my understanding is like the cast that you were talking about, Carrick, that changes it into a type, the specific type that implements an interface.
Exactly.
What is the interface? I'm confused about that.
The interface is something which has a method called serve HTTP. Let me scroll down a little bit. This is the interface for HTTP handler func. I mean, this is clearly an HTTP. This right here is a HTTP handler, if you will, but we want to make sure that so the interface for handler func is something which has a serve HTTP method. Again, this didn't need to, my first middleware, before I knew about middleware, never used this. It actually just instead of receiving a next handler, it received a next HTTP handler func. And it would, instead of calling serve HTTP, it would just call next, open paren W, R. I can probably demonstrate that a little bit better if I go into Emacs, but I don't want to get distracted and burn people's time. So,
I think, sorry, if Aaron, if you look at the example I sent you, because I went through this and twisted my brain 2 weeks ago. I think that was the time I wrote that example I posted on the chat, and I think the thing with the handler func, if I understand you correctly, is that you just at the end of your wrapper or your middleware, you just call what do you call it, the next one that's passed as a parameter, and you don't need to use the serve HTTP, because that serve HTTP is what's used with a handle and not with a handle func. Am I correct there, Carrick?
I'm sorry. I was actually pulling up
Yeah.
your code sample that you pasted.
Yeah.
I can't answer your question.
If you look at it there, I do it without the serve HTTP. I just call, but where you called it next, I called it H, and I just execute H, but I execute it
exactly
with a writer and the response. The request. So I wrap those two together.
I keep interrupting you because of the time lag, and I'm so sorry. This is the way I did it when I first started writing them, because exactly like you did. I mean, whether I call H or next, it doesn't matter. But I wrote all my handlers exactly like you did here, and then I just called H, and because I passed a HTTP handler func around. And that's what I wish. I wish that Go middleware, HTTP middleware, did exactly this right here. I really wish it did, because we'd have a lot less casting. And it's silly, but most middleware passes around an HTTP handler, not an HTTP handler func.
Okay.
So I did this when I looked at the standard library. This was the logical conclusion I came to. Oh, this involves the least amount of code and boilerplate, but that's not what the middleware community did. So I've just changed this to next, and I changed this to handler, and change this to handler. And then I have to cast the return value like I showed in the other screen, and then instead of calling H, you would call H.serve HTTP. But this is beautiful, perfect example of middleware here. Very simple, very elegant.
Thank you. Well, this is one of the things that I think I spent the most time on understanding. So
this is funny. I'm going to highlight this now because one of my teammates just did this to me. He said, "How come you didn't do time.since t_start?" And I said, "Well, because when I did it, I wasn't thinking straight." But it was funny because I'm like, yeah, I guess there's a time since start, but I didn't think about it. But it's funny. But yeah, very simple. You receive the H, the handler func. You do your pre-work, you do your post-work in a defer. You have your little tracer that you're sending to your response writer. You invoke the underlying handler func, and then you've got another tracer afterwards, and then the defer statement runs.
Yeah, I just put them in to make it clear visually for myself to see when things were executed in the script. So in some of my examples, it's too much print lines, but I like them for just learning where things are executed and know the order.
Exactly. Yep. Does this make sense to everybody? Oh, go ahead.
Just real quick, I added an item for next week to go deeper into HTTP handlers and handler func and handle func. And I thought we could go and look at the standard library code and see everything that's going on.
Awesome. I think I've used up our time that you allotted before we talk about the, if we go back to the schedule, and I want to respect other people's time, and I think Ankur wanted to talk about the editor.
Yeah, Ankur, are you still up for that?
Yeah, I'm up for that. Before that, Aaron, can I have, so right now we had this for HTTP handler func, right? So just now, today I received a requirement from company that I have to learn Golang with the HTTP, means build a demo web app with the, so it would be nice if I could give whatever I learned this week in the next week, if you people are okay with that, with the HTTP, whatever I learn in the deeper way for HTTP handler and all. So this will also give me a chance to have a deeper understanding of HTTP functions from the Golang perspective.
Absolutely. Do you know where the Go Study Group agenda doc is at?
That day you have a ping in the chat, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
I
just
put it-
throwing a new link on it right there at the bottom for you.
Nice. Thanks, Carrick.
Sure.
So I
That's
put
it.
an item in there and put my name next to it. And you are absolutely free to just erase my name and put your name if you'd like.
No, I will start with that, and if I'm wrong, means this is the first time I'm going to cover it, right? So I might not be 100% correct or up to the point. So you might jump in and try to correct me, my learning or whatever my understanding is. So that would be the better idea in that
Okay,
way.
that sounds good. All right, I'm going to put that, I'll put that under this bullet point as well to remind us. I'll do that. Why don't you get started with the text editor, Ankur?
Yeah, so how do I get a screen for my own? I don't know how to use Zoom. This is the first time I'm using it.
There's at the bottom, if you hover your mouse or your pointer over the bottom of the window, a little bottom taskbar comes up. You can press the green button in the middle that says share. And then you
sure.
pick one of your windows or the entire desktop, one of your applications or window or the entire desktop.
Okay. Sure, let me just. Okay, thank you. So you guys are able to see my screen?
Looks good.
How? Okay.
Are you only sharing the Slack application or are you sharing your a different window?
No, I'm trying to share something I was not able to share. Just give me a second. Okay. So the basic plan that I am working on with this text editor is it's nothing more of means you can view the text and read and write something and save it as of now. So the basic plan was to have each commit history so that it automatically becomes a go to reference and how to write one from a scratch. So this was the basic plan of mine for this thing, and this is how I'm trying to pull it off. And so right now I will be sharing whatever the learning I had with this till now, whatever I have finished. So if that is okay with you guys, because I haven't finished this till now, because it takes so much of time also from my side.
I'm looking forward to seeing this. It's okay with me.
Okay. So, so first of the thing that I learned with this was the terminal API, the Terminos API, what Linux calls it. So there are two modes of Terminos. So whenever we type password, it's not so displayed to us. Most of the time when we do sudo password. So those are at that time our API becomes in the raw mode, what we call known as the raw mode. And here is the brief. This article was written in 2009, but I find it pretty useful for my case because at that time I didn't have the understanding how this terminal actually works. So I was like that the terminal is the basic API where input and output device is generally connected. But then I got to know no, that is the not the case. It basically our cell goes through the terminus API of the kernel. So are you guys able to see this?
Yes. Could you also put a link to this in the chat later on? This
Yeah,
is
sure.
really cool. That way we don't have to try to write down what's at the top of your screen.
Yeah. So after that, I went through, okay, this is how things works. Then first of the principle of text editor is, so there are two modes. In the means in the canonical mode, you get input line by line. So until unless you press enter or it's the end of the line, the text is not input, means your input is not given to the program. In the raw mode, whatever you type byte by byte is you get the input. So that's where text editor, basically whatever you type, it displaying on the uh, it's shown on the text editor, right? So it's basically switching off the canonical mode to the raw mode. So let me just have this. Okay. So right now I'm writing this with the Linux because my development environment is basically Linux. So all these fields are related to the Linux. It's these field, more detail about this field I am reading from the Linux programming interface, the book. So these details for Mac OS, I only find that Mac OS that this flag and other OS is different. These flags are only different for enable raw mode. Other than that, all these function will does not utilize any OS specific. So I'm pretty sure it will work for in all the other OS. So if you guys, anyone is trying this to run in any other OS, please just edit it for your own OS. So let me just show you how things. So okay, I have this. I have this one. So this is how I disabled the raw mode. Sorry, canonical mode, and this is what it does right now. It is not displaying any text because I have disabled, I guess.
I think we cannot see your screen. I mean, I'm still seeing the blog.
Okay. Are you able to see now?
Yeah.
Okay. So right now it's is it VS
Yeah.
Code is visible?
Yeah.
Okay. So here, first of the thing, what I here from me. So here is the enable raw mode. So this is the raw mode function that enables the terminal to be in the raw mode. So I am also putting down the comment whatever I learn during the process so that it becomes easier for any new person or newbie who is like me to get to know what actually this function is doing and why it is doing so. And then this is the I'm basically using IOCTL function to get all these terminals API before I disable the cook mode or canonical mode, because I have to restore the function canonical mode again, so that the all these whatever we type becomes visible to again. And then all these functions are flags are needed to set to disable the canonical mode on the Linux. So, like control V and control C signal, all these signal I have to disable for the text editor to work basically. After that, once it is done in the main function, then I have to, once the program exit, I have to again disable the raw mode. Means it again become terminal again has to become the canonical, come into the canonical mode. Similarly, let me go one by one over here. So first here what I am trying to get is whatever the standard out file number means on Unix it 1. I'm trying to get what is the terminal size of my window. Terminal size is, I get the row and column, because each terminus has this structure maintained where you can get the terminal window size. So that allows me to repaint my text editor to that row and column. So that is the how horizontal it should be painted and how many rows and column my text editor should have. So if you see here, so this is the row. These are the row my text editor has. And these are the column my text editor will have. This functionality is coming from the value I am getting from my Terminus API. After that, I am maintaining a Go editor state where I am trying to store the initial state of my terminal. Like at what position. So by default, I am cursor row 1. And so by default, the row and cursor at what position when this text editor start, it should be the at the position first row and first column. And these functions are then it enables the raw mode, and if anything happens, just clear on exit, that disables then we disable the raw mode. So here is the thing. So for each iteration before that, I am refreshing the screen. So this refresh screen, okay. So most of the thing I'm doing where to display the terminal. So instead of writing, if I'm not trying to write all the time to the terminal right now, I'm storing it in a buffer and then displaying, writing it at the last of the terminal to make it more performance efficient. And these are the how to display cursor, this VT100 .NET. It's a pretty wonderful doc. And what I learned that most of the Terminus API that we use, it's means where to display the cursor and what is the function parameters it needs to be passed. Like this one, X1B, it is the set mode. Set mode means until unless I have the my screen refreshed, I don't want my cursor to be blinked. So this set mode disable the cursor blinking. And at the last, if you see, the same thing happens with the what is the cursor position. So where do I want my cursor position to be when this function starts? So this is escape. X1B is basically 20 key 27, ASCII key 27. So this is basically the escape key. And then this is the percentage D, percentage, and H is the, so let me just, yeah. So if you see, you guys are able to see this VT100 doc?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So this is where how this documentation has been maintained, that where should be the cursor position should be placed, and this pn and ph. So move the cursor position is specified by the parameter. So I have given these two parameters, and this is where it should be specified. So I'm displaying that this percentage this should be the start position of the whatever the state it is. So it should be the first position. So whenever I start my terminal, it's always displaying at the first row and column. And this draw rows is basically where I'm drawing the number of columns and rows that has to be displayed. So I'm getting the win size struct, and this is the number of rows. Right now we'll leave it, and this is the y-axis, and then if it is less than the number of rows, then simply print at the half of the API. I'm printing this value, like how we see when we enable Vim, right? We get a display of helpful text messages. So I took inspiration from there, and I just wrote this message that vEditor, and with the left padding what needs to be displayed, and at the beginning of each row I'm displaying this tilde operator. So what you see over here, this tilde, it's basically coming from there, this tilde operators. And yeah, so this is what right now it's doing. And second thing is after this row has been disabled, and also I have mapped a certain key action. So I haven't mapped all the key actions. So if I type something over here, you won't be able to see it right now because I'm not inserting character over here right now. This function, I haven't enabled it now. I still need to learn how to enable this thing at which row and how to save into a text editor. This thing I still need to figure it out. But if you see this arrow key up and all, I'm moving the cursor position with cursor row, means cursor row plus plus and all. And this cursor move position is what moving my, yeah. So I'm writing terminal again. If you see, I write to terminal again with the same, what is the current row and what is the current column where my cursor needs to be. And so whenever I do this, whenever what is the current row and my current column, it needs to be, it will display the cursor at that position. And yes, and the third thing I right now did was, so right now the text editor can load with some files also. So I have just hard coded the value over here for now, the files. If there is any argument is coming, I am just putting I have just hard coded certain values so that we display it from there instead of reading, because and then load all the file contents. So I will just give some arguments. So it loads all the file content from there. But there is one issue. I have to figure out how to load all the content. So right now I'm getting 43 line. But if you see the content of the line, it's more than that. So I have to figure out how to vertically first scroll and load all the content into the file without truncating it to load the first few lines. What is the row size? So this is where now the state of where I am. I started last week, means it's been 3-4 days since I am learning this. So hopefully I will be able to, whenever I will be able to complete, hopefully if I have some doubt, you guys can help me, or I will be giving you another demo for this whenever I complete.
I personally would love to see a demo like every week to see like your progress and what you've learned this week. So this is so cool.
That is actually a really good idea. If you don't mind, like every week, show us what you figured out and what you're stumbling on. And, you know, there might be someone who's like, oh yeah, I know how to do X. Why don't you do this? And you're just gonna, you might see it. We're gonna see you develop this into a really mature piece of software, and it's really cool. There's some neat stuff you got going on here.
Yeah. So just one thing, how do you guys like this logo?
It's beautiful.
I really
How
love
did
it.
you make that?
This is the first time I'm making any logo for SOT. So I knew how to, I learned how to do it, Illustrator and all. So I took some ideas from here and there, and I combined all those images to produce this.
That is awesome. Very cool looking.
Very cool.
So I put a comment in the chat. When you're going through your code, I noticed one place where you open your file and then you call defer file close, and then you check if there's an error. Let's take a look at that real quick, if you don't mind, because this, right there, line 379. All right, so let me walk you through why this is a problem. Let's say the file open, the os.open returned nil and an error. What your program would do is it would register file.close as something to invoke at the end of the function. And then on line 380, it would realize, oh, there was an error, so I'm gonna quit. If there was different handling, let's say you returned an error back to a different function, it would execute that defer. And when it executes that defer, file is currently a nil pointer. So you're going to have a panic because you're trying to execute a method on a nil pointer. So every case, every case, whenever you do this pattern of, let's say, resource comma error equals os.open or obtain a resource, you always want to check for the error and handle the error first, because if you got an error, then the resource is going to be nil. And then so move line 379 to after your if error is not nil, that whole blob, and then put the defer at the end, right after the error check.
Okay. So
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that way you will not have, it won't try to make that nil pointer dereference. There you go.
Yeah.
Sure. I have one question as well. Just in this case or in some other case, can any function return file pointer as nil and error as well as nil, both of them as nil?
So some functions could. I mean, everyone writes their own function, to do what they want. But I think the general pattern is if you either return the resource or you return an error. If you really wanted to be smart, or not smart, if you really want to be pedantic and belt and suspenders, you could always change line 382 to say, if file is not nil, then defer file close, and put that in a guard, which is not a bad idea for if you're calling functions that might return both an error and a resource pointer. But I don't know of any examples in the standard library that would do that. I think it's either the resource or an error. So it's up to what function you're calling.
Okay.
All right. Well, this was awesome. Both demos today were really cool. Thank you both. Before we go, I was wondering if folks, I think this was mentioned in the chat too. I'm just going to repeat it here. Would folks like to come up with an idea for a small app and then just work on it together, little bits every week? People be interested in that?
Sounds good to me.
All right. I will put this idea in the chat, and we can see who's interested, and maybe we can shoot some ideas as well, and come up with something. We could just do it maybe for half of a meeting or 20 minutes or something every week or every once in a while, something along those lines. I think that might be fun.
I think that this editor is a really cool app, and hats off to Ankur for starting out and doing this. I mean, I was saying in chat that I've been wanting to dive into TurbIO's IO programming for a while, and it's really cool to see that being done. I almost want that to be the app that we all work on together, but that's Ankur's project. It's really neat, though. I really like it.
No, it's actually I had a chat with Aaron last week that means I can only develop on Linux OS. Maybe we can work together that way. Since I have never worked with any open source project, how to collaborate and all. So it would be wonderful opportunity for all of us to also, because you people can help us to learn how to collaborate in the open source environment and get things done, build, and all those things. How to take positive feedback, negative feedback, and handle all those scenarios also. So it would be wonderful. Yeah.
I'm going to share something in chat real quick. It's a little library that does, you know how you did terminal stuff? It does terminal stuff for Windows and on Unix to get the window dimensions. And I'm going to paste that because it shows you how to actually change your code so it runs, it's in chat now, that Go window size, Go WS. It's very simple. It's not as thorough as what you've done. It's just one little function, but it is a good example of how to structure your library so it can be used by Windows or Unix or many different types of Unixes if they have different handling. And I've got more examples of that if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Now, how do I stop sharing? It's not happening even though I'm clicking.
Oh, I think you need to go at the top of the screen. At the top, there's you are viewing whatever. It might have a red button near the top that says stop sharing.
Yeah,
the top of your window.
Not working. No.
All right. Well, I guess if we all leave, then it's going to be recording forever. Aaron took off.
Okay. I guess
so. Bye, guys.
Before we leave, I have one question. Can you guys suggest some library for front end in Go?
Front end?
Like a front end library for doing web stuff?
Not for web stuff, but just for writing clients.
I'm sorry, for what? Command lines?
For writing clients, like client apps. Just a basic a library which implements just a basic user interface.
I'm not sure I understood. A basic library for HTTP interface?
For writing user interfaces.
For web pages?
Sorry?
You mean how to display the server output in a browser?
Can you please repeat that?
No, when you say front end, do you mean the HTML, JavaScript side of things? How
Yeah.
Well, if you don't want to get into JavaScript, I would suggest start working with Go templates.
There's if he's interested in JavaScript stuff, there's Gopher.js, which takes your code, your Go code, and I think it like converts to JavaScript, which essentially allows you to run the Go code in the browser.
Interesting. So that's different from the Go WASM thing that's going around.
The what?
The WASM WebAssembly, is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm not sure what that is. I've only heard of Gopher.js.
I was actually told about an experimental project. It was a GUI library called Shiny, one of the Go.
Yeah, I read about that.
I haven't delved into it very deeply, but it looked kind of interesting. And they even had it running on an Android device at one point. There was an application, I think it was a calculator or a drawing app of some kind, where you could run it on Android. And that was quite interesting.
Hey, folks. I'm really sorry. I have another meeting that I have to do on Zoom, and it won't let me run 2 meetings at once. So I'm really sorry. I have to shut this one down.
Have a nice day.
Limitations of Zoom.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye. We'll talk soon. I'm sorry again.
Bye, everyone.
Bye everyone.
Bye.